Mars or not to Mars? That's the question coming up on the next Metro Center Outlook.
This program is made possible by funding from the UCF Metropolitan Center for Regional Studies, where government leaders, business executives, and academic experts come together to discuss major issues facing the state of Florida.
Hello, welcome to Metro Center Outlook. I'm Diane Trees, Director of the UCF Metropolitan Center for Regional Studies. My guest today is Pat Duggins, News Director for Alabama Public Radio, but many of you will recognize Pat's voice as the National Public Radio's resident space expert. Pat's covered more than 100 shuttle missions. His first book, Final Countdown, NASA and the End of the Space Program, examined the shuttle program and its demise. We're going to be talking to Pat today about his second book, Trailblazing Mars, NASA's Next Giant Leap. Pat, it's great to see you again. Thank you for being here.
Doctor, thank you for the invitation very much.
Before we start on your book, I would like to ask, I'm very curious as to your background. You have such a passion for space. Did you grow up wanting to be an astronaut? Did you live next to Kennedy Space Center? What prompted all of this?
Well, truth be told, my wife has to put a knife at my back to get me on the log flume ride at Disney World, so no, I don't want to be an astronaut. But growing up in the 60s, I guess I was part of what I've kind of phrased the Tang dynasty, because, you know, back then you're sort of exposed to it all the time, and I was kind of like growing up in the era of Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin. You turn on Gilligan's Island, and they had an episode where cosmonauts landed on the island and matched wits with the skipper and Gilligan.
I remember, yes.
And Barbara Eden, I Dream of Jeannie, which,
yes,
you know, involved an
fabulous
astronaut
show
set in Cocoa Beach. So really, I was kind of exposed to it, but being an Air Force kid, we were in Anchorage, Alaska, when Neil Armstrong landed on the moon. It wasn't until my father was transferred down to Patrick Air Force Base, south of the Kennedy Space Center, that I could, as a 10-year-old kid, walk into my backyard and watch Apollo 14 blast off, watch the Voyagers blast off, Pioneer 10, Pioneer 11, the Vikings. So it was kind of like it was a free show. I mean, you had to pay to get into Disney World, but with NASA, you just walked in your backyard and got a show for nothing.
Very interesting. Well, you've certainly taken to a new level with your detail in your books. I love them. You started out with broadcasting. So what has prompted you to change from the journalism aspect to being an author? That's a different medium altogether.
Constant pestering was the result of it, actually. I had friends were saying, you know, you got to write a book, got to write a book. You know, it's like you cut me and I bleed Tang darn near, because I've covered 102 shuttle missions.
102 now.
102,
wow.
Yeah. And working with NPR, they tend to train you very well. I mean, like I remember one time like 10 o'clock at night, I was absolutely just asleep dead to the world, and they call me up. It's the newscast unit, and they're like, Pat, have you ever heard of an astronaut named Robert Overmyer? And I'm like, yeah. He was the pilot on Space Shuttle mission STS-5, first one to take up commercial satellites. What about it? He said, well, he was killed today. It was a training jet accident. And this is the copy that we're going with at 10 o'clock. Tell us if it's right. The very last astronaut to pilot Space Shuttle Challenger before the 1986 Challenger accident was killed today in an accident. And I'm kind of like, no. The last man to pilot Challenger before the 51L was Steve Nagel back on SDS-61A. Take that part out, put the other parts together. I'll get you some fresh stuff. Go with that, and you'll be okay. So you kind of develop an encyclopedic knowledge of it, merely because you're being trained like Pavlov's dog. It's like this big, never-ending maw where you have to keep shoveling stuff in there.
So this was a way to get it out?
That's it. Yeah. So I mean, you know, you got all this knowledge pent up in there. So everybody's saying, write a book. And one time, and this, you know, totally roundabout fashion, my wife and I very modestly collect art. And one of the things that we really like are the Florida Highwaymen. And
yes.
Yeah, so what happened was there was an exhibit, a dinner actually, to honor the Highwaymen. And the chief editor for University Press of Florida was there. And I just thought to myself, well, you know, fortune favors the foolish. So I just walked up, gave her a card, and said, look, I've covered, you know, 11 million shuttles. If you want to do a book on NASA, let me know. And then 2 weeks later, they let me know. Then I was talking to a main acquisitions editor, who then said, well, you know, what can you write about the space program? And I said, anything. And I said, well, what do you think is going to sell? So they said, well, how about a history on the shuttle program? And I'm like, okay, well, why don't we talk about the new moon program to keep it current? And he said, okay, see you in 2 months. And I just start typing away, and that's book number 1. And I guess it did okay, because then along came the invitation for book number 2. So either book number 1 did okay, or they're gluttons for punishment or something like that. I don't know.
I think it did very well. But one of the things, it's not just the details, but it's the insights that you give along the way. And one thing back to your first book, before we start on this, you mentioned that the excitement of space is not the same as it was, and I think that that's a good background to go into your second book. Can you explain that a little bit, what you mean?
Well, I think when NASA went from Project Apollo, when the budget started getting cut after Apollo 11, we'd achieved the goal of beating the Russians to the moon, so all of NASA's follow-on missions were kind of cut. The agency was sort of pushed in the direction of going to the space shuttle, which was meant to make space flight routine. Now, the problem with being routine is that in the world of pop culture, it's less quote-unquote interesting. Because back when you had the Mercury astronauts, you only had 7 of them, so everybody knew their name and their wife's name and their dog's name. But when you got to 200 astronauts waiting for their chance to go up on the shuttle, I mean, nobody knew who they were. So it was less interesting.
Changed
it was less,
yeah.
But even Apollo had that problem. I was talking to a buddy of mine, Jay Barbary from NBC. And he mentioned during the very last moon mission, Apollo 17, his editor once called him up and said, "Hey, what's going on with the moon mission?" And Barbary actually caught himself saying, "Nothing, they're just going around the moon again."
Well, and you also pointed out that the Apollo program was a program in search of a craft. Probably not the best nomenclature I'm using, but that the shuttle program was looking for a mission.
Yep.
And that changed the dynamics as well.
Well, anytime you go into space, it's not an easy thing. It's a hostile environment. It's very tough to get there. And with Apollo, if you look at it, they built just enough ship to get you down on the surface of the moon and get you back, and that's all. So with the shuttle, they tried to come up with something that was a little bit more versatile. There's a bumper sticker that I really like that said, "God so loved the world, he didn't send a committee." And when they put together the shuttle, they were trying to please so many different constituencies. Like there was the military. Okay, we want to put up our snooper satellites that are about the size of a railroad boxcar, so whoosh, space shuttle has to have this huge cargo bay, which more often than not flew empty, but they had to have the big cargo bay to take care of the military. And then, well, the military says, well, we also have to be able to fly downrange because instead of going around the equator, we may go between the poles. So as you're doing this, the Earth is doing this. So to find your landing strip, you have to have wings. So all of a sudden, the shuttle whoosh, has to have delta wings. So there's a whole bunch of mishmash stuff that went on. And since Congress wasn't about to fund a space station at the time the shuttle first flew,
Right.
it was kind of a space truck that kind of flew around and did cool things, but really didn't have a job. So the whole point of the first book was that, and as you say, Apollo was a mission that was looking for a spacecraft, and the shuttle was a spacecraft that was looking for a mission. And it really didn't have a mission until it started building the space station, which is like 1998, which is 17 years after its first flight, which is a long time to wait for, a very expensive and dangerous program to come into its fruition.
Yes. And now with the new book, you're taking a look at Mars, which, when I think of that, the Red Planet, I still remember the original War of the Worlds and the Martian Chronicles, so I think of all those things. But there's a new excitement. We'll have yet to see how it progresses. But do you think the idea, the concept of Mars is going to revitalize some of the public interest in this?
Well, it's ironic. NASA's been talking about sending people to Mars since the day they created the agency. And I think that's something that a lot of people kind of forget. Everybody says, like, with Obama, hey, it's brand spanking new.
Yes,
I'm kind of like...
and your book points that out.
Absolutely,
yes.
absolutely. October 1st, 1958, they create NASA. October 2nd, 1958, they hire a fellow named Harold Finger, who's an expert on nuclear propulsion, and they put him in charge of a project, as you know, called Project NERVA, nuclear engine for rocket vehicle application. And as far as he's concerned, NASA said, you got the green light, we're getting ready to go to Mars. Now, it wasn't until the Apollo 11 budget cuts that everything started coming apart. But at that point, everybody who was an astronaut back during the days of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin thought we were going to have at least a manned flyby of Mars by 1979.
A manned flyby.
A manned flyby, 79, and a manned landing by 1984. So people of my age, when we were listening to Men at Work and Culture Club, we would have, according to this plan, we'd have had people walking around on the surface of Mars, but it never worked out.
Right, right. What would you say are our benefits of going to Mars? A lot of people are going to ask that because there's a lot of pros and cons along with this.
And they should, and it's something that any democracy has got to have that kind of debate, because it's not chump change to go to the surface of Mars. You want to put something into low Earth orbit, 1 pound, $3,000.
Yes.
You want to send 1 pound to the moon, $15,000. You want to send 1 pound to Mars, $140,000. So it's a big check you're writing in order to do this. So the one thing I'll give you a two-pronged answer on that. Number one is there are people who say that there was not a single scientific advance that occurred because Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, and they're right. But solving all the problems that put him on the moon is where all the technology came from. So if you're of a mind to go down the route of, okay, putting a man on the moon created technology, then going to Mars ostensibly would do the same thing. Number two.
I have to tell you something. When I walk into my garage, I look at WD-40. I will never look at it the same because I see water dispersion, and I know it's the number 40,
Yes.
the formula. So
Yes.
I did. That's amazing.
Oh,
Please continue.
inside joke for the folks at home. Back before they started using Atlas to launch rockets, as you know, they had Atlas to launch people. They had problems with water backing up in the fuel lines. And NASA said, okay, come up with a chemical formula to make the water go away. So they worked on water dispersion formulas. The first 39 didn't work. The 40th one, WD-40, did work.
I think of it every time I
Oh,
look.
yeah. Oh, yeah. And then some smart apple noticed, well, you know, in addition to fixing the rockets, it really does wonderful things to unstick my hinges at home. So they kind of started sneaking the stuff out.
But as you say, that's an example
Yes.
of what has come out.
Absolutely.
One of small examples of what's come out.
And if either of us had the royalties to WD-40, I would imagine we would not be in academics, and I would not be in broadcasting because we would be
Different
flush with
case of
cash there.
things.
There
Yes,
you go.
Yes.
So, coming up with technologies, definitely a way to go. A reason to go to Mars. But if you ask the scientists, they'll tell you point blank the biggest thing that's going to happen when you send human beings to Mars is probably only then are we going to be able to definitively answer the question of did life exist on Mars or does it exist there now?
And there is controversy.
Yes. Yes.
I believe there was a scientist some years ago, Gil Levin.
Gil Levin, yeah.
Yes.
Gil Levin either is going to spend the rest of his life as a scientific footnote, or he's going to win the Nobel Prize for arguably the scientific discovery of the millennia,
It'll
if
be
not the
interesting
century.
to see how that.
Yeah. So the Gil Levin story, in a nutshell, comes up with an experiment on Viking that is designed to look for signs of life on Mars, and he gets a positive result. And everybody with this experiment are kind of like, hokey smoke, we just discovered life on Mars. NASA comes along and they say, no, there was another experiment on Viking that looked for organic material in the soil, no organic, so Levin's wrong. Fine. Fast forward to the Mars Phoenix lander in 2008 that discovers probability of organics in the soil on Mars. So if Mars Phoenix is right and the organic experiment on Viking is wrong, then it's possible NASA discovered signs of life on Mars in 1976 and they ignored the findings.
And the level of frustration must have been incredible for that scientist. So.
Well, I was there in 1986. It was right after the Challenger accident. My first shuttle assignment. I decided to take a road trip up to Washington because they were having a 10th anniversary celebration for Viking. In other words, it was 86, Viking landed in 76. And among the people there were Carl Sagan, that's where I met him and interviewed him, that's how it wound up in Trailblazing Mars, and I met Gil Levin. Well, that's fine, except he kind of walks up there and literally rolls a grenade into the scientific tent at the National Academy of Sciences by saying, guess what, guys? I've spent 10 years trying to duplicate conditions that would have proven my life experiment wrong, and I haven't been able to do it. Therefore, Viking discovered life. Boom, says the scientific community. His friends were walking up to him saying, you really shouldn't have done that, you know? And even NASA treated him very respectfully. They just simply said, look, we looked at the results, we don't agree with them. As far as they're concerned, it's kind of like two scientists say, it's going to rain today or it's not going to rain today. One of two things is going to happen. It's going to rain or the sun's going to go down. And as far as they're concerned, they didn't have enough evidence to say, we believe in Levin's experiment, but it's possible that Mars Phoenix proved that he was right.
It'll be interesting to see how that is resolved as we go forward with things. You mentioned that with the shuttle program, NASA has been more of a vacation, and now we're looking at really getting into what is space travel. Can you tell us a little bit? I thought that was a very good way to phrase things.
Well, I have to give credit where credit is due. The person who actually coined that phrase was Neil Armstrong, because I was at Kennedy Space Center in 1989 when they had the 20th anniversary of Apollo 11, which was the first manned moon landing. And he kind of got up there and said, we'd like to thank all of the people at the Kennedy Space Center for enabling me and Buzz and Mike, the other crew members on Apollo 11, for taking a summer vacation. And basically that's true. You pack all the food that you need, you go off, you come back. And up on the space station, you do the same thing for maybe 6 months. You go to Mars, totally different, because you can't pack a bag lunch big enough to take you on the 6-month trip there, a year on the planet, and the 6-month trip back. So you're going to be more like Shackelford when he did his expedition to the South Pole. Instead of bringing a lot of food, he brought tools and he brought bullets, because they basically had to live off what it is that they found there. So technology is going to have to be created in order to allow people to go to Mars long term, which is why I kind of chose Trailblazing Mars for the title of the book, because it's very much like trailblazing the American West back in the late 19th and 18th centuries. You have to live off the land, solve your problems, and if you don't, you die, and that's just kind of it. The difference is that we didn't have CNN telling us what happened to the Donner Party. So when we go to Mars, then if there's a problem on the way there, what do you think Houston's going to do? Oh yeah, we'll send the AAA for you. Don't worry about it. Leave the hood up on your spaceship so they'll know that it's you. Okay. The astronauts are going to have to solve it on their own, or they're not going to make it, and that's why it's going to be totally different from the vacation-style missions that we've been doing up to now.
Well, and I know there's some debate about when we get to that point, whether they're sent with a mechanical backup or whether they go with I think it's called a chemical base for things, or the biogenerative, so that they have things to grow when they're up there. And there's pros and cons for both, but they're radically different approaches to taking a manned flight that far.
Well, if I was going to Mars, what you're referring to very correctly is they want to send unmanned robotic missions first to kind of set up your base before you send people.
There's a big case for that, about taking the robotic and not doing manned.
Oh, but by robotic, in other words, it's like you're making a reservation at a hotel. In other words, you want to know your room's waiting for you when you get there. I mean, that's what they're doing with that plan. In other words, you're sending like a robotic mission that will land your habitation module and maybe a nuclear generator and maybe an agriculture module to grow food, so that the astronauts know, and an escape vehicle too, so the astronauts know when they blast off, no matter what, they've got somewhere to go to. It's not like they're landing there and it's like, well, great, what do we do now? So you have to have some kind of way to sustain yourself. So if you send the sustenance part of the mission when the astronauts land, then okay, they know where they're going to go. So I mean, that it's robotic, but it's kind of like making sure you've got a base of operations there. It's like when you're going, you're going to survive when you get there. That's the big deal.
And they're so far away.
There you go. That's it exactly. And there's some people who say that we could do it in maybe like 2 missions and then send people. Some people say, well, let's do 3 robotic missions, be really sure of it, and then we'll send people. It's kind of chicken and egg sort of a thing. But if you're going to send people to Mars, there's no way you can rescue them if something goes wrong. So having some supplies waiting for them when they get there is actually, if I was going, I'd want that.
Well, and not only are we going for a farther distance, but you clearly put forth a lot of the dangers and the perils that are going to be faced, far more than even our trips to the moon have been. Radiation, isolation, a whole host of things.
Yes. We were talking earlier about creating technologies that as we went along the way to the moon, one of the big deals they're going to have to come up with is to be able to protect the astronauts from radiation, not only during the trip, which is like, depending on how you go, 3 to 6 months one way, but also once you get on the planet. Mars has an extremely thin atmosphere. So I mean, Earth, we have parts of our atmosphere that screen out UV light, and we also UV rays from the sun, and also we have the Van Allen belt that prevents solar radiation from killing us. Well, you don't have that on the moon. I mean, pardon me, you don't have that on Mars. So protecting them from the constant bombardment, not only of cosmic rays and radiation, but also just meteorites. I mean, a lot of the meteorites that hit Earth burn up in the atmosphere. Now,
and they wouldn't
on Mars, yes, that's it. So anybody who saw the movie Silent Running with Bruce Dern, and you've got like all of these wonderful domes where you grow food and stuff like that, they can say, domes on the moon and Mars, no way it's going to work, because you're going to get constantly bombarded by space rocks, and also the dust is going to collect on the outside of your clear glass dome.
You need the technology to make a dome that would be sturdy enough and yet not be coated with the dust, because the dust is going to cause another problem altogether.
Absolutely, that's why they're talking about artificial lighting. In other words, they're almost it's less romantic, it's less Hollywood, but they're talking about like big compartments that they might just drop into Martian lava tubes and have artificial lighting, and you grow food there.
Right.
So it's a whole bunch of different problems you have to solve. We got a long way to go before we're done.
Well, I found it very interesting too when you talked about the isolation factor, because the right stuff. What makes the personality for an astronaut, which would be a type A personality, you're talking about that might not be the perfect crew member for going to Mars.
Well, let me tell you a story about a space station mission there. They were putting up a brand new toilet on the spacecraft there. They had one, they wanted to expand to 2 because they were increasing the number of people who would work there full time. So what you had was a situation where you had the space station crew and a visiting shuttle crew all crammed into the station at one time. 13 Type A, best of the best, Roger Ramjet, Tang drinking folks, yes. And the commander actually went on to a press conference and said, the one thing that really worries me is that we got so many people here who are absolutely just so success-oriented, success-driven, that everybody's going to get in each other's way simply trying to help, because they're kind of used to success-driven, kind of ambitious. And so that's why psychologists looking at a Mars mission are thinking, maybe instead of hiring Superman for this, we might want to go with Clark Kent, because you need somebody who's going to be calmer and roll with the punches instead of these like, yes sir, A-OK kind of types that they usually hire when they get astronauts. So the right stuff probably is going to get tweaked a bit.
Well, and I saw that there was a selection of who you would want, I believe among crew members of some, that actually picked the crew member of choice would be the mechanic.
Yes.
Which
makes perfect sense, because if you're halfway there and your ship breaks down, it's going to be Engineer Scott from Star Trek who's going to save you.
Yes.
So you got to have somebody there doing the Hootmon stuff as far as fixing your ship and getting you back. That's why an astronaut kind of like Don Pettit comes immediately to mind, because Don Pettit is a nice guy, astronaut, been up several times, but he definitely seems to fall into the Clark Kent kind of
like the MacGyver kind of thing.
There you
That's
go.
what I thought on your book.
That's it, exactly. He had with him what was known as the strange tool bag. And what he would go is, if something was broken, he'd break out the main tool bag and just literally start soldering resistors and fixing things.
A great guy.
That's it. He even came up with a new kind of a space cup so he could have his morning coffee. It was just like a plastic cover off of an instruction book that he just simply made into a teardrop, put in his coffee, and allowed the surface tension to hold it steady, and he would just drink it that way. And everybody at Houston is just going like, what? Like they were very impressed by his ingenuity, which means that either a Don Pettit or a Don Pettit wannabe probably would be a very valuable person to go on a mission to Mars.
It sounded like ingenuity with a combination of common sense approach with things. And I thought about the Apollo 13 mission when they put all the material on the table and said, this is what you have to fix it.
Yes.
He sort of took, that, to me at least from what I read in your book, that there was that kind of approach with it. We obviously have a lot of issues with the financing of a program like this. But the other aspect of it is the American people. Do you think you're going to have death? There's no question you're going to have some accidents with something like this. Do you think we have a society that is willing to accept that that's an inevitable outcome with something like this?
I think that it's going to take a change in mindset of the American people as much as it's going to take a change at NASA, because it is entirely different in terms of what they're going to be facing and how it's going to work out. However, if you're going to go to Mars, you simply are going to have to make that adjustment. I mean, there's just no two ways about it. And whether or not the American people are going to be willing to go through the risk and the cost and accept that fact, I mean, it's the way that it's sold, I guess, really, because like when President Obama put together the Augustine Commission, it was a group that was going to chart the future course of NASA and give Washington a number of alternatives. They weren't going to make the decision, but they'd say, look, you can do this, this, or this. They actually factored public relations into what they suggested to NASA, because they said, look, there's the thought about going back to the moon. Obama killed that. He said, well, there's also the possibility of sending astronauts to explore an asteroid, which you can do in 10 years. So they actually said the reason they suggested that was not only are you able to work out technologies there that you can apply to a Mars mission, but since it happens faster, you're giving a fickle public and a generally disinterested Congress at least something to say, well, we're achieving something at NASA, which I just thought was just a revelation, because NASA does not toot its own horn. So it makes it very easy for critics to to come out of the woodwork and find reporter types like me and say, well, this is what's the matter with NASA. And NASA apparently has been criticized for not doing a really super job at saying, well, this is what we do.
Right.
So it's almost like fighting with your arms tied behind your back.
So you point out in the book there's a lot of different aspects of science. Is the science worth the effort and the money and the will to do this?
Well, let's put it this way. When Columbus went to Ferdinand and Isabella and said, give me the money to go to the New World, he said, give me the money to do this, and I will convert the natives to Christianity, and I will bring you back gold and precious stones. He brought back potatoes and tobacco, and he gave the natives smallpox. Now, if he put that on his application, do you think the king and queen would have given him the money? I mean, there you go. But getting back to the notion of actually finding out whether or not there was life on Mars, I've spoken to scientists who say point blank that humans have to go and do that, because the only way you're going to find definite evidence that life is on Mars or was on Mars is to go to areas that are or were geologically active. Now, when you do that, you're talking chasms, you're talking canyons, and you're talking areas where a Mars robot could very easily topple over, and a human being has at least the common sense to back up. Now, the Opportunity rover was almost lost because it was going through an area that's one of the robotic golf cart size rovers that are crawling around on Mars, was in an area called Purgatory Dune. And it got stuck in the sand. And NASA spent 5 weeks trying to get that vehicle out, and the mission was almost lost. Purgatory Dune is 1 foot deep. So, I mean, when's the last time you ever went to the beach and called the Coast Guard to save you because you got stuck in 1 foot of sand, you know?
That's right.
Oh my gosh, I'm not going to make it. The sandpipers are coming to get me and all this sort of stuff. It's like, yeah, so that's why with human beings on the ground, proponents say that, you would be able to explore the more dangerous areas and actually, find evidence of life on Mars.
Pat, we're at the end of the program. I do have one last question I have to ask you, though.
Sure.
Do you feel that we'll get there? Do you think?
I think that, getting back to my earlier comment about, God so loved the world he didn't send a committee, the bumper sticker, I think that it's going to have to take a real effort on the part of the American people and an effort on the part of Washington to do it.
Come together.
Yeah, because like with Kennedy, there's a school of thought out there that if John F. Kennedy had not been tragically assassinated, we wouldn't have made it to the moon. Because even at that point, he was thinking of, okay, forget about the moon, let's talk to the Russians about a joint space station. And if he had survived, you would have had Congress just nitpicking back and forth about whether or not we'd make it to the moon. And since he was gone, the moon became his gold watch. Let's do it for JFK, that sort of thing. So, and as soon as we landed on the moon, the money went away. So are we going to make it? I don't know. But if they are, then that's kind of the way that you'd want to go about it.
Thanks, Pat. I appreciate your time. I could go on and on asking you questions. Thank you so much. Please, Trailblazing Mars, NASA's Next Giant Step by Pat Duggins. Thank you. Thank you all for watching Metro Center Outlook.
This program is made possible by funding from the UCF Metropolitan Center for Regional Studies, where government leaders, business executives, and academic experts come together to discuss major issues facing the state of Florida.